Today we explore the intriguing narrative of a Jew named Shlomo, also known as Fillipo, who found himself ensnared by the Inquisition in Venice during the 1580s. He was raised as a Christian in Portugal during a time when Jews were not allowed to reside there. But his journey took a profound turn when he went to Venice and embraced Judaism there, a choice that carried substantial risks. His captivating story can be learned through the archives of the Venetian Inquisition, but fascinatingly, also through not one, but two rabbinic responsa. In the late 1500s, there was a Rav in the city of Salonika whose name was Reb Shlomo HaKohen, and he's known as the Maharshach. Salonika is in Greece today, then it was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Maharshach writes in the introduction to his Shilos Achuvis in the first volume, it was printed during his lifetime, that he is the rabbi of a community that he labeled as Girush Castile. And that is, there were Jews in the region of Spain known as Castile, and they had fled in 1492 and settled in the Ottoman Empire, and he was their Rav, he was their rabbi. And during his lifetime, he published 3 volumes of his Chuvas, Reb Shlomo HaKohen did, the Maharshach, and the 4th volume came out after his passing. We're going to read from this 4th volume, Siman Lamed Aleph, and he writes the following. The story, the question that was presented to him is Anus Echad. There was an Anus. An Anus is someone who was forced to convert to Christianity, but it could also mean that his parents were forced to convert to Christianity and he grew up in that type of family. Meanuse Portugal, coming from Portugal. In 1497, the Portuguese government forced all Jews to become Christian. They weren't even allowed to leave. In Spain in 1492, Jews had a choice. Stay and become Christian or leave the country. In Portugal, all Jews were told that from that day onward, they were de facto Christians and had to behave that way. So we're talking about someone who is from a family that went through that conversion process in 1497. Now this individual, he does not have a name at this point, Haya beVenetia, was in Venice. Venice is the most important city at this time in Italy, at least from a commercial perspective, it's the most important city. The story continues, V'nitfas biyad hachoikrim. He was caught by the choikrim, the investigators, or in other words, by the Inquisition. In Spain, there was an Inquisition. In Portugal, there was an Inquisition. In Venice as well. During this time, in the late 1500s, there was an Inquisition as well. And he was caught by them. Umitza'uhu mahul. And they found a problem. What was the problem? The problem was that he had a bris, he was circumcised. And the issue with that was that he's coming from Portugal, which presumably means that he was baptized as a child, and didn't have a bris as a child, was from a Christian perspective a Christian, but then now he's in Venice and looks like as an adult he reverted back to Judaism and took on a bris. So from a Christian perspective, this is a big problem. V'hitzil atzmai, so how did he save himself from being punished severely by the Venetian Inquisition? Kishen nishtamed, he converted. He basically said, you know something, I will embrace Christianity. And they said, you know something, if you're going to do that, then you will be saved. And this is what happened. Oh, so tell me, the inquisitors say, who gave you this circumcision? Now, the Shaila as presented to the Maharshach says as follows. He could have saved himself from this situation. If he would have said, a Jew from Germany or a Jew from the Ottoman Empire of our Etzlai was, passing through Venice and gave him the bris and he's no longer here anymore. That's what he could have said, and in that way, no one would have been harmed. However, he didn't say that. He acted wickedly. He said Reuven is the one who gave him the circumcision. Reuven is obviously a pseudonym. It's not a real name, as is often the case in Shalos Tshuvos. We're not using the real name. Okay. Moreover, he did another wicked thing. In order to demonstrate that he indeed was embracing Christianity wholeheartedly. Hilshin as Shimon. Now, he actually reported on Shimon, V'amar alav, and said that Shimon, again a fake name, Shehumal leben achiv, gave a bris to his nephew, and his nephew was in a similar situation like him. Was born in Portugal, raised as a Christian, from a family that was forcibly converted. And he too had a bris, and he gave that information to the inquisitors. Mashaloi nidrash al kacha, and this was not necessary. What happened as a result of this? Reuven, the one who gave him a bris, had to flee. To go to a different land. Also his family had to flee Venice and go elsewhere. What happens when you need to flee country to go elsewhere? So you have to sell your possessions, but because you're in a rush, you're not able to get the true market value for things. They sold all of their furniture, all of their items, for whatever they were able to get in that pressing moment. In addition to that, another loss they had, so it was very expensive for them to travel from one place to another, until they reached the Ottoman Empire, where the Moyo, Reuven, was able to come. And this leads us to the Shaila. What's the Shaila? Yelamdeinu Rambeinu. Teach us, our teacher, Reb Shlomo HaKohen. Im Chayev HaMoiser, this Moiser, who is called an Anos in the beginning, and then we started calling him a Meshumid, is he Chayev to pay to Reuven all of the damage that came to him by exposing his name to the Venetian Inquisition? Why? Remember, he could have said, I was given a bris by some random person happened to be passing through Venice, but he was wicked and he pointed him out. So is he chayiv to pay the damages, the financial damages that he caused? Umagam, in addition, min hadin hoya sheyareg v'lo yehareg v'lo yavar. The din is that really, instead of embracing Christianity, the din is that one of the things normally Pikuach Nefesh pushes off everything. But one of the things Pikuach Nefesh cannot push off is to embrace Avodah Zarah. He embraced Avodah Zarah by embracing Christianity. So really that is another piece of evidence to show you that he's really making bad choices over here, and that should be another added factor to suggest that he's guilty. In addition to that, he did more wicked things. Because his wife and his children during this Maisa were not with him in Venice. They were in a safe place in a Jewish community. It's not disclosed where, but they were not in Venice. They were somewhere else. And he sent letters to his family, to his wife and his kids, and he cooperated with the Inquisition that they should be brought to him, and indeed they came back to Venice, and they went through Shmad. So this is really showing how this Anus is really making a series of really bad choices. And therefore, in Cain, the reason I'm throwing in all this information into the question is Mikol Zen Isbar, because all of this shows us, Shakol Masha Asa, everything that he's doing is Bepesha Uvamal Asa. He's really wicked. He's really rebelling. Lima Amal B'Hashem, he's rebelling against God, and he's rebelling against Reuven. In other words, sometimes when you want to make a case that someone is guilty or innocent, you want to, you speak about the person's character. And here, the main thrust of the question is, this person had a choice. He didn't have to say any names. And in that way, no one would have to run away from Venice. None of the Ma'ilim would have to run away from Venice. But Paul, he made that bad choice. Now, how do I demonstrate, how do I show you in my question that he had an easy option out but chose not to do it? I'll show you. Look, generally speaking, he's a Rasha. He brought his family back. That shows he's a Rasha. In addition, he himself went through Shmad and Yahareg V'Yaver. Really, he has to be willing to submit to death. And so for all these reasons, this is a little bit undermining his character, which is why we should not believe him, and we should believe me when I say that he had an option to get out of this without reporting on anyone. This is the question that Reb Shlomo HaKohen was asked, as we're going to be able to tell, sometime in the 1590s is when he was asked this question. Okay, there are three sugyas that come up in this tshuva that Marashach has to address. Question number one, when a Jew is faced with this situation, where they are told, you better tell us who your moil is, or we're going to really make your life miserable. In fact, we're going to, as the Inquisition would sometimes do, you're going to, chas v'shalom, they turn to that person and say, you're going to be killed if you don't tell us the name of the moil. In that situation, is it permitted for this converso, or marano, whatever you want to call it, is it permitted for him to disclose the moil? That's question number one. Or do you say, no, you're not allowed to, no matter what, you're not allowed to give up the name? Sugya number two is, the question assumes that because he converted to Christianity officially, that makes him a Rasha, and now you can't trust him for anything. Is that true? Does he have the chalois, does he have the din of a Rasha? Do we label him as a Rasha? And this has real important implications for Jewish law by the very fact that he did something that's wrong, and that's he converted. Question number three, heyois, because he caused damage to the moil who had to now run away, is he indeed liable to pay for the damages that he caused? Each one of these, really, you could do a full class on this, and there's a lot of sources, but we're going to try to just touch and give a small taste of what the Marashach discussed along the way for these three questions. So the first thing is to discuss, in this situation, was he allowed to spill the beans? Was he allowed to say who gave him the bris? So let's read what Marashach has to say in number 2. I'd like to address some of the words that came into the question, that were included in the question. And some of the words basically said that the mesirus, the mesira that he did by exposing the name and by conveying the name to the inquisitors of who gave him the bris, he didn't do this machmas oines because he was forced to do it. He did it beratz and muchlut. And the argument was because he could have said the moil was a passerby moil who gave me the bris. So Reb Shlomo HaKohen says, interesting argument, but it's eina oila ala das. This doesn't actually add up. It doesn't make sense. If you know a thing or two about the Inquisition and how it operated, there's no way they would have bought this argument. Why? And he continues to say that it's very unreasonable that a person would say, you know something? A bris, I'll trust someone who I met yesterday who's passing through town. I don't know anything about him. He says he's a moil. I'm an adult. I'll allow him to give me a bris. Why would a person do that? Most people wouldn't allow a medical procedure to be performed on them in this way. It's much more reasonable that you say, this person's a moil in town. I know who it is. I have references. He has experience. Let me get a bris by him. And Marashach says that the Inquisition would have known that, and this is common sense. And so therefore, for you to write in your question that this guy could have easily just said this and would have solved all the problems, this is not true at all. And he says, there's no way they would have dismissed him and let him off just by that. In fact, they would have pressed him. They would have pressed him until he would have told them who gave him this bris. And so therefore, once we establish that, so now this brings this question and really highlights this question. Given the fact that they were going to force him to do it, does he have to submit to death in order to avoid exposing the name of the moil? Or is he allowed to expose the name of the moil? This is the question that the Marashach is going to address right now. However, before we continue, I'd like to say that what we saw here from the Marashach, refusing to accept the idea that, he could have just said it was a moil from Germany and everything would have been good, was a very insightful statement for Marashach to say, and that's because of something quite fascinating. Between 1980 and 1999, there was a set of books that was published in Italian, called and translated into English, Procedures of the Holy Office of Venice Against Jews and Judaizers. This is basically, they went to the archive and they found files files of the Inquisition in Venice, where they were dealing with all different types of things, amongst them dealing with Jews who were doing things that were improper from their perspective, or Judaizing refers to someone who's not allowed to observe Jewish ritual because officially he's a Christian, and if he is, then that's a problem. And they had many of these files. So there was a scholar by the name of Zoratini, and he published these transcripts of these trials in 14 volumes. So Zoratini writes as follows. Between the year 1541 and 1600, there was 1,565 hearings that they have documented. The vast majority of these actually have nothing to do with Jews. 803 have to do with the fact that at the time in Europe, there was the Protestant Reformation, and you have many Christians who said they were not happy with the Catholic Church and they were breaking away. This was considered heresy, and the Inquisition was running after this problem and trying to deal with this problem. Most of the hearings were over that issue of Protestantism. Then there was another 199 were dealing with witchcraft. This was something that the church was always concerned about, witchcraft, and if someone was suspected of engaging in that activity, the Inquisition would go after them. 199 are dealing with those. 73 have to do with Jews or people who are supposed to be Christians officially who are engaged in Jewish behavior. 73 of the files are referring to that. There's a known outcome in 25 of these 73 cases. In other words, the full file is there where you're able to see the whole story of what happened. 9 of the cases, the people were acquitted, you're innocent, you're fine, you can go back home. There are no executions, unlike the Inquisition in Spain and the Inquisition in Portugal, where there were many executions. The Inquisition in Venice, which is what we're talking about, didn't have any, at least in this file, there were no cases of executions. There were a handful of people whose punishment was banishment for life, which means they have to leave Venice and they can never return. Torture, there's only in the file 2 references to torture. Doesn't mean it didn't happen more, but in terms of references within the folders, within the files to torture, there's only 2 references. So this is an overview of the general stats of this set that came out during the 1980s and 1990s. Now, one of the files concerns a man who goes by the name of Fillipo Nice. Fillipo the first name, Nice the last name. And his story, as it comes from this file, is basically as follows. In the year 1585, there is a pastor who comes to the Inquisition, and he testifies that this man, Fillipo Nice, is a problematic individual. On the one hand, he does not live inside the ghetto, meaning all Jews need to live inside the ghetto. He lives outside the ghetto, and he dresses like a Christian. Jews had to wear special clothing, Christians who wore special clothing. He dressed like a Christian. So that seems to suggest that we're dealing here with a Christian. However, he eats meat on days where the church prohibits the eating of meat. He has no images of Christianity at home. They observe him preparing meals on Friday, presumably for Shabbos, and he was seen going to shul on Shabbos as well. So this is what the pastor testifies in front of the Inquisition. So what does the Inquisition do? On Shabbos, October 12th, 1585, they arrest this man named Fillipo Nice, along with his nephew. His nephew's name is Jacob, and they arrest the 2 of them. And they ask Fillipo to make a statement. So now Fillipo makes a statement. He says as follows. I was born as a Jew in the city of Porto, which is in Portugal, around the year 1531. And I, obviously, in 1531, you're not allowed to be Jewish in Portugal, so our family were secret Jews, crypto Jews. And I was circumcised as a child, and my name, I received the bris as a child, not as an adult. My name was and is, my Jewish name is Shlomo. I left Portugal in order to live openly as a Jew, and the same story is pretty much true for my nephew, Jacob. Why do I live outside the ghetto, and why do I dress in Christian clothing? That's me putting on a show for business purposes. It's better for me to appear as if I'm a Christian, and so I wear the black hat instead of the yellow hat, and that's why I live outside the ghetto. In other words, if I did a crime, what was my crime? I lived outside the ghetto. If I did the crime, what was the crime? That I wore Christian clothing, that's it. And so whatever punishment is associated with a Jew behaving as if he's a Christian, I'm happy to pay that fine or whatever it is. But that's it, that's all I'm guilty for. Well, the Inquisition wasn't going to buy it, and the record reflects that they basically told him as follows. Hold on a second. In 1497, the King of Portugal declared that all Jews need to convert to Christianity, and from our perspective, this happened. And there was a program to baptize as many Jews as possible. You were born some 40 or so years, 30 so years after this. So we assume that you were baptized when you were born as a child, which means that you're a Christian, which means there was no problem that you lived outside the ghetto. There was no problem that you dressed in Christian clothing, but all your bad behavior, that's called engaging in Jewish behavior, which is not allowed for someone like you. And so therefore, we have a problem here. He responds back, never happened. Although I did grow up in Portugal, I was never baptized. And that was feasible. It was possible for someone who, it just never happened. It was probably difficult, but it just never happened that they got to that family or to that child and had them baptized. And I was circumcised as an infant, and that's when I got my bris, and that's his story. So he's standing by his story. Well, they decide they're going to do an examination. And remember, he's arrested on the 12th of October. On October 31st, they send in a surgeon who is an expert in surgery and a meshumid, a Jew who had converted, unfortunately, to Christianity. And they were going to do an examination on him to look at his bris to try to determine when this happened. And they both testified that from their perspective, this bris was not a child's bris. It happened in recent times. When he was here in Italy as an adult is when he had his bris. He responds to them when he's presented with this. He says, nope, I did have an infection about 18 years earlier as an adult. Maybe that's what they're being confused by the infection that I had, but my bris that I had was definitely as a child. He continues insisting for the next few weeks and months that he was never baptized. He complains he didn't get a lawyer, he didn't get a copy of the accusation against him, and he's trying to defend himself, he's trying to continue with his story. On June 10th, in 1586, June 10, a Meshumid visits him and tries to convince him, let's go, game's over, come over to the other side. Fillipo says no, he wants to die as a Jew, and he's happy, and he's ready to go on Kiddush Hashem. However, something changed within the next few days. On June 12th, he informs the authorities, the Inquisition, that he's willing to come around. He's seen the light. And on June 14th, he finally presents to the Inquisition a new story. And he says that indeed he was born in Portugal and to a family that was living as Christians, and he was indeed baptized as a child, and he never had a bris. He was indeed baptized as a child. As an adult in Antwerp, he then converted to Judaism, but he chose to live both. You know, when it suited him to live as a Jew, he lived as a Jew. When it suited him to live as a Christian, he lived as a Christian. When he came to Venice, that's when he decided, you know something, I don't want this double life anymore. And he says, I'm living as a full Jew. And he says he's ready now to abandon Judaism and to embrace Christianity in full. But about the bris, he says, I want to let you know, I never had a bris. Not as a child, not as an adult, and anything that looked like something that has to do with an infection, but a bris I never had. So this is an amazing thing, because at this stage in the story, what we have over here is, although he's saying he's willing to embrace Christianity, but about the bris, he's still not willing to say that he had a bris. However, the story doesn't end here, and on July 29th, he finally says more. He says, you know something, I'll admit, it was a year ago, I was sick, and I wanted to do something to get closer to Hashem. I called a Jewish physician. His name was Ben Arogios. That's the name he gives. And he says, this physician gave me a bris. And he says, my nephew, who you also arrested, received a bris by a different moil whose name was Nar. His last name was Nar. And now he's basically open with the fact that he received a bris. Now, this author, whose name I told you was Zoratini, he writes that there were very few instances of torture, but he says that the record here reflects that this Fillipo, was indeed tortured. And that would explain why the story perhaps took a drastic change. So now, the Inquisition in Venice has two names. they have the name of Ben Arogios, and they have the name of Nar, two Jews of Venice who gave a bris to someone who, from their perspective, is a Christian, which is illegal. So they send a notice. These two individuals must appear before the Inquisition within 9 days. Well, obviously, they didn't show up, these two men. On 17th of October, 1586, they announced their verdict. They said Fillipo is guilty of being an apostate from Christianity. They gave him a prison term of 2 years. They said he has a whole bunch of ritual obligations, that he has to pray a certain amount of times or whatever, spiritual things. He's not allowed to leave Venice, and he has to place a bond of 1,700 ducats in order to guarantee that he's not going to leave. And he's obligated to bring his family back because his family was elsewhere. He's obligated to bring his family back. It's not clear when exactly they left, but within a year. On that very day, he took an oath on a Christian Bible that he's going to be a loyal Christian. On 14th of November, 1586, the court, the Inquisition announces that Ben Arogios and Nar, the two Mayalim, because they failed to show up before the Inquisition, they're perpetually banned from Venice, and if they were ever to come back, they would be burned or drowned in public, and anyone who reports them, there's a reward of 100 ducats. The story continues that on May 9, 1587, Fillipo was freed from prison. Indeed, his wife, whose name is Furtada, is brought back and takes an oath that she's going to be loyal to Christianity. And then in 1589, we have on the record that Fillipo says, please, I want to have my money back, the bond back, and he has a priest attesting that he's indeed an Orthodox Christian, and it seems that he gets it back, and that's where the record goes cold, and there's no more information in the file on this particular story. Now, the first thing when you hear this story, is the correlation between the story in the Sha'al Teshuvas Marashach and this particular record it fits very, very well. Detail for detail, the way we have it in the Tshuva of Marashach, whether it's a reference to Portugal and the reference for Venice and the idea that he said who his moil was, and in fact he said the person another moil gave a bris to his nephew. He brought his family back. All of those details that you have in the Tshuva, we have in this record, which makes this very unique, because I don't think we ever have, and if we do, it happens very, very uncommon, where you'll have an Inquisition record that will actually be reflected in a Tshuva to a Rav, highly uncommon. Now, another thing that we gain from this whole thing is that we see that Marashach's insight over here was spot on. Marashach said, there is no way he could have got off easy by just saying the moil came from Germany. In fact, what we see in the story is he tried his best to conceal the fact that who his moil was. Even once he said, I'm ready to take Christianity. If you remember in the story, he said, no, the bris wasn't a bris, it was an infection. And it seems that it was only due to torture that he in fact said who his moil was. So the idea that he could have got away easy, which was put into the question and could definitely influence the psak, we're seeing the Marashach is not buying that. And that's why Marashach says the question is a different type of question. What's the question? The question is, when someone's in that situation where the Inquisition is pressing them very hard with torture, threatening perhaps even to execute them, are they allowed to, in that situation, save themselves by saying who the moil is? So let's see how the Marashach is going to address that question. So he brings the story, the famous story, a famous Gemara, in Psachim Daf Chof Hei Amid Beis. And the story over there is that there's a Jew who comes along to Rava and says that the master of my city, the governor, the mayor, whoever it is, says, I need to go kill so-and-so, and if not, I'm going to be killed. So the question is, am I allowed to kill somebody in order to save my own life? So Rava responded, very famously, you have to allow yourself to be killed. You're not allowed to chas v'shalom kill somebody else. And he used the line, what makes you assume that your blood is redder than that other person? Perhaps his blood is more red than yours. In other words, translated, what makes you think your life is more precious to Hashem than that person? Perhaps that person's life is more precious to Hashem. The idea that you can go ahead and take someone else's life in order to save your own, you're not allowed to. So at first glance, if you look at this, you would apply this. Now we have his name, so we could use his name. His Hebrew name was Shlomo. So you come to Shlomo and you say, look, you want to save yourself. But you want to save yourself essentially by condemning someone else to death. To give a bris to a Christian is a big no-no. So you're not allowed to based on this Gemara. Very interestingly, Reb Shlomo HaKohen says, not so fast. Not so fast. Why? He says there's a significant difference between our case with Shlomo from Portugal and the Gemara in Psachim. What's the difference? He says that in the Gemara in Psachim, the issue was where the person wanted to go ahead and do a Maisa B'Yadayim, an act of actually killing another Jew. To that, the Rava said, you don't have a right to do the act of Ritzicha to save your own life. To do an act of murder, you don't have a right to do. However, he says, in our case, that's not what we're talking about. Our case, Shlomo's not going to murder anyone. What's going to happen? What's going to happen is he's giving information. And as a result of that information that he's giving to the Inquisition, so maybe this other person is going to be harmed. So, obviously, it's something you try to avoid, and it's not something you're allowed to do. But if it means saving your own life, then maybe, he says, because it's not a direct act of murder, this is going to be permitted. Now, what gives him the right to make this distinction? So he calls a Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Reitzeach Perek Gimel says the following case. What happens if we know that the Torah says that if someone is guilty of murder, obviously you have to have all the in terms of witnesses and warnings, but the person could be chayav misa, liable to receive the death penalty. However, what happens if a wicked person ties someone up and didn't murder them? But because the wicked person tied the victim up, the victim was now not able to eat, and as a result of that, the person died. So is there a death penalty in this case? And likewise, other cases where it's not a direct murder, it's a little less indirect, it's a little more indirect. What is the din in these cases? So the lashon of the Rambam is, Ein memisin oisai. In these cases, there is not going to be a death penalty. The Rambam is quick to add, V'harei hu roitzeach. Of course, the person is deemed to be a murderer, but the din that he's going to be dragged in front of a bezdin and perhaps executed, that's off the table. And the Rambam says further, V'doirish damim doirish mimenu dam. What about his guilt? What about justice? That's just in Hashem's hands. Hashem is going to take care of that. So what do you see? He says, you see that when it's indirect, all of a sudden Bezdin says, hands off, we're not going to issue the death penalty. So too, when it's indirect, he thinks the rule of Yehareg Va'al Yavar also is going to fall away. Usually we say, you're not allowed to kill in order to save yourself. But if it's indirect, he thinks that it's going to be different. And therefore he concludes this part of the tshuva saying as follows, Marashach does. Shemasha yu oinsin oisai, sheyagid v'yara lehem, mi hoya amoyol shamal oisai. This that they were forcing him to expose and to say who was the moyol, v'heim yasu itoi kirtzonim, and then they would do it. He's not going to do anything, they're going to do it. Here we don't say Yehareg V'al Yavar. Now, this is a subject for itself. Because you think everyone agrees with this point. There's no way that all poskim agree with this point. There is definitely the case that there are poskim who say that the rule applies just the same for when it's indirect and you're just giving information. The rule is going to be there and you can have a full discussion just on this. But at the end of the day, the question came to Marashach. So our focus here is Marashach, and this is his position. His position was that in this case, Shlomo, in order to save his life, was actually allowed to give the name of the Moyel ben Arogios. He was allowed to say, this is who it is. But again, there are definitely poskim who are going to disagree with this, as we know from other tshuvas and from other sources. Now, the second issue that we need to address is that in the question, they presented him as a terrible Rasha. Therefore, we should assume the worst about him, that he's definitely just disclosing information at will. Why? How do you know he's a terrible Rasha? Because he violated a din. He had to allow himself to be killed instead of converting to Christianity. So that's true. That's true. The din is that a person has to allow themselves to be killed, not to embrace Avodah Zarah. However, Marashach says, to use that, though he didn't do the right thing, does that make him a Rasha now? Where now, halachically, we look at a Rasha, so therefore we don't give him the benefit of the doubt anymore? Says Marashach, no, that's not true. In fact, he still has the benefit of the doubt. Why is that? So he says, because when a person is forced to do Avodah Zarah, although the din may be that they should have allowed themselves to be killed instead of doing it, but if they went ahead and chose to live, it's considered an oinus, it's considered compelled, and halachically we don't regard the person as a rasha. What would be an nafkamina? Is this person kosher le'edus? So someone who's a rasha is not that. We can't allow their testimony into a court of law because we assume that they're lavdafka saying the truth. But would we say the same thing here? Says no. We would accept his testimony. Where do you get that from? So Marashach says, let's go back in time to a tshuva that was authored by Rabbi Yitzchak bar Sheshas, otherwise known as the Rivash. The tshuva, the Rivash Siman Yud Aleph. This is a very, very interesting tshuva. In 1391, as we've discussed numerous times, there was major, to use the word, riots, pogroms against Jews throughout the Iberian Peninsula, and many, many Jews were killed. Many Jews were forced to convert to Christianity. This happened in the year 1391. The Rav in the city of Valencia, his name was Rabbi Yitzchak bar Sheshas. He fled from Spain, and he ends up in Algiers, and he becomes a Rav there. He passed away in the year 1408 on Erech, so it's roughly around the last 18 years of his life that he was living in Algiers as the Rav over there. And he has the following question that he fields from a man named Amram Efrasi. And he's in Oran asking a question to the Rivash who's in Algiers. What was the question? A lady showed up from Spain. And she says the following story. I was married, I lived married with my husband in Spain. I was converted to Christianity. He converted to Christianity, as many other Jews did. However, I got a get from him. He stayed there and I have a get, and I want to now come live as a Jew, and I want to remarry. I want to marry a Yid. I'm not a Eshes Ish anymore. I'm not married because I got a divorce from him. Here is the document. Look at the document. Witnesses. Who are the witnesses on the document? Jews who converted to Christianity under the same compulsion. So the shaila is, are they kosher Edom? So if you say that they're Rishoim, they're puzzle for Eidos, this get is not good, this woman now can't remarry. If you say that they're not Rishoim, now we know they converted to Christianity, but could you say that they're not Rishoim, which would make the get valid? What does the Rivash say? Let's read Tshuva. You should know. Shemi sha'avar al kol mitzvahs hatayr beinis. Any aveira that a person did, even if it's avodas gilulim avodas zara, which means that they should have submitted to death. If they did the act, loy nifsal le'edus, they do not become pasal le'edus, kivin sha'asa came ba'oinis, because they did this forcibly, and anus rachman patra, which means you're not going to be liable for punishment. You did the wrong thing, you're not going to be liable for punishment. That also means you're not going to become a rasha for legal purposes, which means you're kosher for edus. However, the story doesn't end here. The Rivash, though, continues and says, but I need to offer an important qualification. This is not a general statement that we could just apply in a general way. Why? He says, this that I said, that the person is not considered a rasha, that's assuming that when he's in private, when he's in his own home, when no one is forcing him to do avedis, he's nizar mikol avedis shebetayra. In other words, the vision of a Marano who lives a double life where in public he's acting like a Christian, but at home he's doing everything possible to live as a Yid. That's when I'm going to say that he is still kosher le'edus. But if when he goes home and no one's looking and he pulls a shtickle chazer out of the fridge in order to eat it because he says, I anyway have to do that when I'm out with my friends, so I'll do that here at home, then no. Then this person is pasal edus, because now he's not no one's forcing him to eat that chazer at home. So now this person is pasal edus. Now even though the whole story began because he was walking down the street and the mob came and they forced him to convert. So the story began with a oinus, yeah, but right now he's making a choice at home and that choice isn't being forced, so that renders this person a Russia. Why is this relevant? The Rivash says, I have information about what's going on in Spain. And it's not the case that they're all from at home. That's not the case. He says, in fact, there are two camps of Marranos. There are two camps of these Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity. He says, some stayed. They didn't try to run away. They didn't try to leave. Why? Because they're happy. They have the ability to leave, but they're not interested in leaving. And even though, again, the whole story started ba'inus, but now, they're happy to now go and follow Gentile ways, and oivrim al kol mitzvahs ha'torah, even in private. Then he goes on to say, in fact, it gets worse. From amongst these conversos, who decided they're dropping Judaism even at home, amongst them you have a wicked bunch who actually are getting involved in persecuting fellow Jews. And he writes that they want to abolish the Jewish nation. And then he says, and they do their best to find out others that are similar, forcibly converted, and to report them and say, oh, by the way, they're observing Judaism in secret. So he says, this class of people, and he says, I got this information from Valencia and from Barcelona. He said, this class of Marranos, we cannot consider them legal Jews anymore. The Lashon he says is Elam Chelek Be'Elokei Yisrael, and they're obviously Pasol Le'edus. But then he says there's another class who remain there, but they want to leave. Why didn't they leave? They can't afford it. It's hard. It's difficult. And while they're there at home, when they're able to, they keep Torah and mitzvahs and they're nizar and they're careful from Avedis. So that is the class of people who are not Pasol Le'edus. And so therefore he says to Rabbi Amram Efrasi, he says, you need to find out about these conversos. We can't say all of them have a cheskas kashrus, he ends, because the other group is significant. The bad group, so to speak, is significant enough that in every case you have to do a chakir and drisha and find what type of Marano is signed on this get. And that's basically going to let you know if this person is kasher le'edus. This is a summary of the tshuva of the Rivash. What's important for our purposes, when it's clear the person is being coerced, the person is not a rasha for any act, including avodah zarah, if it's being coerced, even though they have to allow themselves to be killed. Says Marashach, in our case, did Shlomo have to say, no, I'm not embracing Christianity, do whatever you want, which is what he said at one point in the story? Yes, he had to say that. But the fact that he didn't doesn't render him a rasha, so you can't add that into the record to say, and so therefore let's assume the worst, that he's a moiser and that he just wants to hurt fellow Jews. You can't do that. In fact, he has a cheskas kashrus, he has an assumption of innocence, and so therefore you cannot basically use this to undermine his character. And so in this way, we answered two of the subjects that we needed to address. The first, was he allowed to report the moil? According to the Marashach, very interestingly, yes, he was allowed to report the moil. Number two, is he a wicked person? He did for embracing Christianity, at least on the record. The answer is, it was the wrong thing for him to do, but that is irrelevant to the discussion because it doesn't say anything about his character, it doesn't render him into a rasha. Now we come to the third thing. What's the third thing? The third thing is the most important question. And that is, at the end of the day, generally speaking, when someone causes damage to someone else, you need to pay. We all understand that. If Reuven causes damage to Shimon, he's liable to pay for damages. So here, Shlomo, who is known as Fillipo, he caused damage to the Moel ben Arogios. Is he obligated to pay him for his damages? So now we're going to focus on that part of the question. So I need to give a little bit of Agdama. And this is really a huge subject that we're going to touch on right now. And we're mamish going to scrape the surface, just that. And many Rosh Yeshiva are able to produce numerous shiurim just on this one subject. Generally speaking, the Torah limits liability. In other words, the idea that I'm going to be liable to pay to cases that's called mazik biyadayim. And that is where there's a very direct and concrete connection between the actor and the victim. In fact, we saw that earlier with the murder case. That when there's a real murder in a very direct way, the person is going to be liable for the death penalty. When, however, it was a little more indirect, where he tied the person up, so although we're going to call the person a murderer, all of a sudden we see the Bezdin says we're hands off. So it's not only that way in murder cases, it's also that way in torts, it's also that way in damages. Where we say when a person does hezek biyadayim, I go over to your window and I smash it with my baseball bat. So clearly I'm going to have to pay for that particular damage. But there are so many cases where there's a financial harm that's brought about indirectly. And the way the Gemara refers to this is grama. And the din is, grama is pater. Grama is pater. We are not going to discuss today why. It's a fascinating discussion. We're just going to accept that as a fact that grama is pater and needs to be direct. However, obviously it's usr, even though it's indirect, doesn't mean you're allowed to do it. You're still not allowed to. And a bezdin, if it sees me engaging in that activity, will come over to me and say, hey, you got to stop that because indirectly you're causing harm to another person. And the Gemara will say you have a chiyuv b'dei shamayim, like, God is going to extract punishment from you one day. So it's not like you didn't do anything wrong. You did. But at the end of the day, the Bezdin is not going to come and say that I'm liable for a case of indirect damage. Now, at the same time, we have a Gemara that says there's something called garmi. Garmi is essentially the same word. Causing. Not direct, causing. And here we have a machlokes in the Gemara. Where the Gemara says, some people say that even though it's not mazik biyadayim, it's only garmi, still you're going to be liable in that case. There's a huge discussion amongst the Rishonim. What makes garmi all of a sudden different, and now you have a machlokes. So again, we have three categories so far. Grama, you're potter. Mazik biyadayim, you're chayiv. There's this middle category called garmi. It's not entirely clear what fits into this middle category, but for the purposes of our discussion, a moiser is garmi. And that is when a moiser goes over to someone and says, hey, governor, I know that you're always looking for new trucks for your military. There's a Jew who just got a new truck. And you don't know about it. I'm letting you know. You may want to, take that from him and it's going to be beneficial for you. So I didn't take away his truck, right? So the Gemara says, it goes into the category of garmi. Why is it garmi and not grama? Also that we're not going to talk about. But the bottom line is, there's a machlokes in these types of cases. The simplest way to understand this, the Marshach does, somehow it's a little closer to hezek biyadayim. It's not so indirect, it's a little more direct, and therefore, even though it's a shtickle indirect, the din is going to be chayiv. Now, there's a machlokes in the Gemara about whether a garmi is going to be, a moiser is going to be chayiv or not, and it depends on, do you believe in this middle category of garmi? Says the Marshach, yes. There is a discussion about whether a moiser is going to be liable. However, that's only in the case that I described before. What's the case I described before? Where I go over to the governor and I say, he has a car, so I'm talking about his car. So somehow that's like more direct. Now I'm going to be liable to pay for his missing car because I did that. Says the Marshach, that's not the case that happened over here. The Shlomo, Fillipo, didn't speak about money. He didn't speak about finances. He didn't tell the Inquisition about where money is. What he did was, he said that this is the guy who gave me a bris. As a result of that, he lost his money that he had to pay for travel and his job and all those things. So that for sure doesn't belong in the category of garmi. That belongs in the category of grama. It belongs in the category of grama. We all understand that the din is going to be potter. This is what Marashach has to say. And then he goes on to say another thing. Even if you're not going to buy that argument, even if you're going to say, no, this too is garmi, hold on. You have another problem. The problem is, okay, we're going to call Shlomo in, Fillipo, we're going to say, you need to pay Ben Arogios for losses. So he's going to say, prove me how much I caused him loss. I bring you witnesses. He has a very valid taina. Now Ben Arogios has to bring witnesses about how much it caused him to travel. Now there's this concept of, we can make logical deductions. So in a court of law, he will have a right to say, I don't want logical deductions. For all I know, you got a ride. Maybe someone was nice to you and gave you a ride and gave you a horse and buggy. I want you to prove to me that you actually paid. You think he's going to be able to bring witnesses? I had a parnasa in Venice whether I earned this amount. Prove it to me. I don't believe you. So all of a sudden, he's going to be in a very difficult position. And that's another reason why, at the end of the day, he's not going to have to pay. And he concludes, if you look at 12 in the last paragraph, I don't see a way to obligate Shlomo to pay to pay the damages that came to Ben Arogios because of the fact that he exposed him. And then he adds, and this is all assuming that he spoke willingly. If you say he was tortured and he was threatened with death, then you're adding a whole nother factor, which is a reason to say that he's not. But even if you assume that he spoke freely, at the end of the day, number one, again, it's not garmi, it's grama, because he didn't speak about his finances. He didn't say he has a car, he has some money, anything. He said he's the one who gave me a bris, so it's in the indirect category, a grama which is going to be potter. Doesn't make it mutter, but a grama which is going to be potter. That's our question now. Is he going to be liable to repay? And secondly, we don't go by haychachas. You need witnesses for the losses. You think he's going to be able to bring any witnesses? He's not going to be able to bring any witnesses. He signs off his tshuva, however, with the following caveat. Let's read number 13 inside. From the question, it seems to me that this moiser, meaning Shlomo, Fillipo, is oimed chutz mimakom she'ira lo ya'ina, so he's outside of Venice now. It seems from your question, he returned to Judaism. Because if not, why am I getting this question? If Fillipo is in Venice, living as a Christian, I'm here in Salonika, you're asking me this question about someone who's living as a Christian, he's never going to show up in a Bezdin, and we have no authority to make any penalties on him. So obviously, it's interesting because the question didn't say that. But he's assuming, Marshach is assuming, you have to assume with the information that you have. So he's assuming with the information that he have that he returned to Judaism. So if he's returning to Judaism, he needs to go through a process of tshuva. A serious process of tshuva he needs to engage in. And including in that, when you sin, bein adam lachavere, we said before, grama, you may be pater, but it's also, you're not allowed to do it. So that means he needs to go to Ben Arogios and he needs to beg mechila. Now, in this case, where he caused them financial harm, part of begging mechila is to actually appease him through paying him money, even though a bezdin can enforce it. But remember, because we say chayiv bidei shamayim and things like that, so that means that if he wants to make good and he wants to be restored to the Jewish community, part of that is that he has to appease him, which would mean giving him money for the losses that he caused him. And this, he says, is even if we accept my view, and that is he was forced, even still, in that situation, it would be the right thing for him to do as part of his reconciliation with Judaism. And this is how the Maharshach concludes his tshuva. There was another Rav that lived at the same time in a very different region in Poland. His name was Maharam Lublin, mayor of Lublin. He passed away a little after Maharshach, but they're roughly contemporaries. And during this period of time, in the 1590s, Maharam is a very prominent Rav in Lublin. Later he was a Rav in Lvov. He's most famous for the commentary in the back of the Gemara under the Maharsha. That's a commentary to the Gemara, but he also has tshuvas. Let's read Simon Samach Aleph of his tshuva. Maisa Italia. There's a story in Italy he's being asked. Sha'anus echad, where there is a converso, Shahaya Sham Chutz Mimachane Yisrael, who is living outside the Jewish ghetto, and Nitfas Al Yedei HaChakira Shal Koinrim, and he was caught through the inquisitors of the priests. Uvatku Aisai, they examined him. Umatza'u Shahaya Ma'ul, they found him circumcised. V'Oisa Kamaisa Yodim, and that he behaves as a Jew. Zeh Anus Chazar Ledasam, then he embraced the other religion. V'Yada Lifnei HaChakira, and he went to the Inquisition. V'Amar, and he said, Ploini Malani, I will receive the bris by so and so. V'Ratfu HaKoimrim Achar Amoyol Kiminhagam, and they pursued him, and he had to flee. And the question is, does he need to pay damages? Here again, it matches up detail to detail with the Inquisition record, as well with the tshuva of the Maharshach. The language of the question is not the same. And there are a few minor details of emphasis that are different here and there, but largely it does seem to be the same question, which is very fascinating and is a little perplexing. Why would the same question go to two different rabbanim? Migration between Italy and Ottoman Empire happened. In other words, if you were running away from the Christians in Italy, a great place to go was Ottoman Empire, and that happened. Poland, a lot less so. So the fact that the question is being asked a second Rav, the fact that we have a record of a story from three different places is just so highly unusual, just makes this case very bizarre, and it's very interesting that the question was asked to the Maharam. Now, let's continue reading the question, because here we're going to learn something really important. Yelamdeinu Rabbeinu, teach us, Maharam. Im hikra Hashem lavoi, if God caused the following circumstance to happen, ladun b'nichsei Amo Yisrael, now that we'll be able to drag him into court and sue him. So then, im chayev l'shalom loy kol hatza'osav, is he going to be obligated to pay all of the expenses that the Moyo ben Arogios had to lay out? Notice over here, in the language of the question, something we did not have with the question of the Maharshach. Here, a Maharshach assumed this guy returned to the Jewish community. This is a real question. But here we see that the way the question was worded to Maharam Lublin is, if God helps that we're going to get our hands on this guy, which implies that at the time this question was asked, they didn't have their hands on him. And the truth is, if you go back to the tshuva of the Maharshach, you'll notice the question was very one-sided. There was no two voices in the question. It was only the question from the perspective of the Moil, who's completely character assassinating Shlomo, Fillipo, and saying bad, bad. And we never at once have a summary of what the Shlomo has to say, which also seems to indicate that even the Maharshach, he's not here in the Jewish community yet. Yet the question was asked. So why is the question being asked? So you could say one approach is that, sometimes it happens that Bachram are sitting in yeshiva and they hear of a case and they say, I'm curious what the halacha would be, let's ask her up. But I don't think so. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think that although he wasn't here, there was an expectation that he was going to show up. There was an expectation that he was going to show up. Why? Because they knew of so many cases that were happening at this time where someone today may have embraced Christianity under the clutches of an Inquisition, Portugal, Venice, whatever it is. A few weeks, a few months later, the guy reemerges as a Jew. So there was a certain assumption and a betachin, so to speak, that this person is going to show up, which is why he asked this question. That's my reading of this particular tshuva. Again, from the record of the Inquisition, we don't know. The last we hear is he got his money back, he got his bond back. They testify that he was living for a year and a half as a good Christian, and then the record goes cold. What happened after, we don't know. I'm suggesting that from this tshuva, we see that the Jewish community expected that there was a reasonable chance that this person was coming back, which teaches you something about the climate at the time of how these types of things were working. Now, what's really interesting, what's Maharam's answer? And obviously we don't have the ability to learn two tshuvas in one shir, but his answer is basically almost completely opposed to everything the Maharshach had to say. First of all, he says that in a case where you're being forced to tell you who the moil is, you're not allowed to. You have to allow yourself, chas v'shalom, to be killed, not expose. I mentioned before, some place I'm going to disagree. Maharam in this tshuva says that. The second thing is, he says, this is garme. This is the category of an indirect damage where you are going to be liable. He says for certain cheshbonis you are going to be liable, certain not. We don't have to get into it, but the bottom line is he does see some financial liability, except he says if he was forced. If he was forced, there's no, the concept that a moiser is obligated to pay, yes, we have that in Shas. But a moiser who was forced, he's not obligated to pay. And so therefore, because he assumes that this person would have been forced, and we know indeed from the record he was, the bottom line result is Marshach and Maram Lublin would end up at the same place where this person is not liable to pay, but for different reasons. Marshach is because the difference is, what if he gave up the information freely and willingly? That's where Marshach would say his analysis of the sugya of grama and garmi leads him to say he's completely exempt. Maram Lublin would say, he gave the information freely. Grama and garmi, he's obligated. He's obligated to pay in this case. Let's conclude this fascinating tale with a Rashi from this week's parsha. This week's parsha we learn about the Milah of Avram Avinu, and Rashi points out that the pasuk says that Avram Avinu did his Milah be'etzam hayom hazeh, on that very day. What does the Torah mean to stress when it says be'etzam hayom hazeh? It says Rashi bayoim v'loy balay. He did it during the day, and loy nisyarei loy min hagoyim v'loy min hatzanim. He wasn't afraid, not of the Gentiles and not of the scoffers. So I think we could pause here and say that in our story we saw something very similar. We saw Shlomo himself going at great risk in order to have a bris, and the moyalim, two moyalim, one who did him and one who did his nephew, both of whom know this was a very dangerous thing to do, also did not have the fear, a Yerusha from Avram Avinu. Rashi continues and says, V'shala yiu oivav uvnei doirei oimrim. Another reason why the bris had to be during the day, so that the people shouldn't say, Ilu ra'inuhu la, if we would have known that he's trying to do this, la hinchanuhu lamu, we wouldn't have allowed him to do the bris, ulekayim mitzvah shamakim, we would not have allowed him. You can't say that. You all knew it was done in broad daylight, and nonetheless, we see that he did it. Here also we see this pattern in history, as we saw in this particular story, where there were non-Jews who came to halachic Jews and said that they are not allowed to do a bris, and we're not going to let them do a bris. And b'poil, what we saw and what we found over here is that in reality, they found a way to do a bris, going at great sacrifice. And I think it's very telling that in the tshuva, both to Maharam and to Maharshach, as I said before, there was an assumption. These people, no matter what they did and no matter what mistakes they did, the end of the story is they're coming back to the Jewish community. There's a certain confidence that that's going to happen. And, I think the details of their story, the fact that they went on Mesiras Nefesh for the bris, would be a reason why that would be particularly so.